only purpose in even being here today, get out and vote. You know that.
Your vote is your voice, and your voice is your power. Are you ready to make your voices heard?
Tomorrow is Election Day, the culmination of 2 years of campaigning, including a frantic final few months of the race. Looking back to May, former President Donald Trump was consistently leading in the polls over President Joe Biden. Then there was Biden's disastrous debate performance in late June, which set off panic inside the Democratic Party and led to mounting pressure for Biden to drop out of the race. On July 13th, Trump was shot in the ear during an attempted assassination at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. A week later, Biden ended his campaign and endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, who officially took over the top of the Democratic ticket in early August. Harris breathed new life into the Democratic Party. She erased Trump's lead in the polls and eventually built her own advantage, while raising more than $1 billion for her campaign. Harris was widely seen to have won her September debate with Trump, but that Harris' polling lead has evaporated over the last month as many voters continue to believe the country is heading in the wrong direction. And now the race is a statistical dead heat according to the polls. Today the candidates are making their final pitch to voters. To help us track that and much more, Julia Manchester, national political reporter here at The Hill. Let's talk about what the candidates are up to today on this last day of campaigning. Harris is basically camped out in Pennsylvania. Trump is going to hit 3 battleground states. He started in North Carolina, then he's going to Pennsylvania, then heading to Michigan. Can we learn anything about the state of this race based on where these candidates are in this final day of campaigning?
Yeah, no question. So Pennsylvania, obviously, I think a must-win for these candidates. Out of all 7 of those swing states, Pennsylvania has the most electoral college votes, and we've seen that poll after poll mostly shows a dead heat between the two. So you're definitely going to see both of them spending a lot of time. For Harris, it's important that she brings out the Democratic base in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then you're going to see really Donald Trump focus on those rural areas, but the suburban areas outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, obviously part of that key battleground region in that state. For North Carolina, though, we've seen Donald Trump really for the past few days crisscross the state, spending a lot of time, for example, in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County area. There are some concerning warning signs for him among suburban women voters in general. So to keep North Carolina red, he has to make sure he's messaging to those North Carolina voters in those suburbs. Harris going to the Raleigh-Durham area, definitely trying to make a play for those white college-educated voters in that research triangle. And then, of course, Michigan. I was chatting with a Republican strategist before this, and he essentially said, look, Michigan is a hard state for Donald Trump. We've seen some warning signs for Harris among the Arab American population, the white working class population there. But in general, I think you're going to see Donald Trump try to improve his standing there as much as he can before tomorrow.
We're getting some final polls in ahead of the Election Day. I want to talk about the final poll from the New York Times and Siena College. We've been following this throughout the campaign. It shows Harris with small leads in Nevada, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Georgia, tied in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and Trump with a small lead in Arizona. All of this was within the margin of error, so take it as you may, but I guess the bottom line is maybe really nobody can know anything based on these polls. But I wonder if there's anything in those polls that you found interesting, late deciders maybe breaking for Harris, Trump leading with people who saying they're going to vote on Election Day. What do you make of that poll?
I think women in general, independent women, like we've seen in some of these other polls that have come out in recent weeks, they are really showing that they are breaking for Harris, or at least showing some enthusiasm. The Trump campaign will point to other polls. They really came out against this poll yesterday, but it's important to point out that it is very much within the margin of error. But I would point to those independent women, particularly in these suburban parts, suburban Detroit, suburban Phoenix, Las Vegas, these big cities. Watch out for the independent swing voters there that are women. I think they're going to be deciders. In the past few polls we've got, whether it's from the New York Times, the Des Moines Register, etc., those are showing higher enthusiasm among women, really in a race that has become sort of a man versus woman, boy versus girl race in the election.
Yeah, let's talk about that. There was a poll that came out of Iowa over the weekend that really rocked the political world, actually showed Harris leading 47-44 in that state that Trump won twice, caused an uproar on social media. Everybody was talking that over the weekend. One, what did you think of that poll? And two, if it's anywhere close to being correct, what does that mean for the rest of the states that are in?
Yeah, so the pollster, Ann Salter, is quite good. She's widely respected, and she's gotten it right a number of times. At the same time, though, I think she would say this, she has said this, the poll had a 6-point margin of error, so take it with a grain of salt. I think it's going to be difficult for Harris to outright win Iowa, but chatting with Republicans, they say, look, it is closer in Iowa, not only at the presidential level, but in some key House races in Iowa, so something to certainly take a look at. We talk about sort of the top line with Harris leading Trump. I think the more interesting part of that poll is once again going back to these independent women. So Harris leading by 28 points with that group in this poll, and then of course with women over 65 by 35 points. We know that voters over the age of 65 tend to lean more Republican, so that's a big warning sign for Donald Trump, and I would say that it's a warning sign in the blue wall because Iowa, obviously in close proximity to Wisconsin. I've heard Iowa described as Wisconsin without the Milwaukee, so the Trump campaign should certainly be paying attention to that. They're dismissing it, pointing to a separate Emerson College poll that showed Trump leading among men and women and leading Harris by 10 points. So we're getting a mixed bag, but I think there are some legitimate warning signs for Republicans in that poll.
It's interesting that you draw that comparison to Wisconsin because it's the state that Biden won by the least amount in 2020, a place where the Harris campaign has been concerned about. So if this poll is anywhere near right, you would think that would portend to good things for Harris in a place like Wisconsin. I wanted to talk about Donald Trump being given some free airtime on NBC during a NASCAR race last night. This was to compensate for time that Harris was given during this appearance on SNL. On Saturday night, the network was accused of breaking the equal time rule from the FCC that requires networks provide comparable time and placement to opposing candidates. There had been some complaints, including from an FCC commissioner. I guess, what do you make of the significance of both these appearances, and could there be any repercussions for the networks based on how they handled this?
I think it's certainly possible. It's something that the networks, not only NBC, are going to have to keep in mind going forward. Look, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, well, we've even seen Donald Trump do it since 2015, but Harris isn't the first presidential candidate to come on SNL, so this is something NBC has had to grapple with in the past. That being said, though, what I thought was fascinating is that you also saw Virginia Senator Tim Kaine appear on SNL, and his opponent, Hung Kao, the Republican, had an interesting response. He brought up the FEC complaint, but he also said, well, instead of going on SNL, I was meeting with Virginia voters. I was in my home state. I wasn't busy doing this. I thought, it got a lot of praise from Republicans, that response to it. But instead, at the national level, at the presidential level, I see Republicans talking quite a bit about the FEC portion of this. I think at a time when you see much of the media landscape as a whole getting a lot of backlash for being biased, it's certainly notable.
And Democrats seem to be leaning into kind of the Hollywood, New York celebrity part of this that they've had in the past and lost elections. So it'll be interesting to see post-election whether people think that helped or hurt the Harris campaign. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is primed to play a role in the Trump administration if Trump were to win the election, but controversy surrounds his stances on things like vaccines and public health matters such as fluoride in water. When pressed, Trump said that he will make the decision about any RFK Jr. role in his administration, but he's also said during rallies that he can kind of do anything that he wants. Yeah. What role do you think RFK Jr. could play in a Trump administration? And also, do you think all this talk of his potential to play a role in the administration will help or hurt the Trump campaign in this final day?
Look, I think the Harris campaign is certainly seizing on it or pouncing on it, if you will, trying to maybe sway some independent voters who might look at someone like RFK as being a controversial figure. I thought it was interesting that the Harris campaign is trying to tie him to the anti-abortion movement. We know that abortion is a key factor in this election. So I think it certainly has the possibility, the chance to hurt Trump. In terms of what role he will play, I mean, it's hard to say right now. I think RFK is someone that plays well with the base, the Republican base, in particular male voters, for example. So it could be a campaign tactic right now, but I think if he were to have some sort of a major role, there would be so much pushback from Democrats in Washington and even some Republicans.
There's a lot of doctors and nurses in this country, and I wonder how his influence or the prospect
Right.
of his influence plays in their minds as they head into the voting booth. Democrats say they are concerned that Donald Trump is preparing attacks on the integrity of election results if he were to lose tomorrow. Democrats say they worry that this time around, Republicans may be more willing to play into Donald Trump's attacks on the system and go along with attempts to maybe subvert the results. What are the Democrats saying about their worries, and are there steps that have been put in place that might protect the integrity of the vote and these election results?
Well, look, you have Vice President Harris talking about it quite a bit on the campaign trail. It plays into her democracy and freedom theme and messaging. So she's certainly talking about it, using it to essentially warn voters of the possibility of what could happen whether she wins or loses. In this case, obviously, if she wins. I think this is very poignant for a lot of voters because we went through this 4 years ago, and it did in many ways have deadly consequences with January 6th and the people that died as a result of that attack on the Capitol. So it's certainly serious, I think, for a lot of these voters looking at it. I think a lot of it also depends on what happens at the local level. I mean, a lot of these precincts and counties and such, it's on them to report the election results. And I'm curious to see if, they will face pressure from former President Trump, if, some partisans in those precincts, et cetera, could face that pressure. I think we'll be watching out for that. I think there have been some safeguards put into place in that we're maybe not widespread, but we're more prepared this time because we saw what happened in 2021. So I think everyone's bracing themselves really for the worst.
I want to ask you about some comments from House Speaker Mike Johnson that he's walking back what he previously said, that he had made some comments that he was going to possibly repeal the CHIPS Act. This is a piece of legislation that has poured billions of dollars into the U.S. semiconductor manufacturing industry. On the campaign trail, Trump has been critical in recent days of the CHIPS Act. Johnson has now clarified, saying that he wants to streamline the legislation but not repeal it. Democrats, including Kamala Harris, have been quick to pounce, saying they have a better plan to create manufacturing jobs in the United States. Just look, they're trying to repeal this very important piece of legislation. How do you think that is playing out in this election?
I think Mike Johnson has to be very, very careful because where he made those remarks was in central New York, the Syracuse area, for a member that is facing a really tough re-election bid. I would say that part of New York State is definitely a part of the Rust Belt, and definitely has been hurt by a lack of manufacturing, a lack of those economic resources. So he has to be careful about how he approaches this because the CHIPS Act is something Democrats have touted as a major accomplishment of President Biden. It's something that has been popular. It may not be popular with the hardcore Republican base, but with independent swing voters, I think it's proven to be, it's something that Democrats can point to and say, look, this was a job creator. So the fact that Speaker Johnson is walking this back, I think, says it all.
Yes, another case where Speaker Johnson is having to walk a tight line between comments that former President Trump is making that may possibly hurt some of his districts, especially that our Biden districts,
right,
where he's trying to retain those Republican Congress people. In addition to the presidential race, we're closely following the battle for control of the Senate. With the retirement of Joe Manchin in West Virginia, that state is almost certainly to flip to Republicans, and they just need one more to take control of the Senate. Two states that we're watching very closely, Montana and Ohio. We're also watching races in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. How confident are Republicans today that they can take control of the Senate?
I think they're feeling pretty confident, particularly in Montana. Senator Jon Tester, Democrats, certainly facing an uphill battle there. I would say that Montana is different, and Jon Tester is different from Sherrod Brown in Ohio, in that Sherrod Brown is seen as an institution in Ohio. He is seen as, he's obviously the last statewide elected Democrat in Ohio. He has catered a lot of his campaign messaging to fit, his constituents. There are a lot of brown Trump voters. I think Sherrod Brown also ran ahead of Obama, for example. So Sherrod Brown, I think, has proven in past elections that even though it's always a tough race for him, he can withstand it. I think in a state like Montana, where it's more rural, it's just, I would argue, even more red than Ohio, that's going to be difficult. I want to also pay attention to Pennsylvania. I think Bob Casey certainly, I wouldn't say he's vulnerable, but he's not as vulnerable as Brown or Tester, but it's certainly going to be very close in that state. Remember, you have races up and down the ballot in Pennsylvania. Obviously, presidential, you have those House races, Auditor General, Attorney General. So Pennsylvania voters just inundated with all of this political information. So that's what makes Democrats somewhat nervous in that state, not as nervous as Ohio and Montana.
All right, Julia Manchester, we'll be seeing you tomorrow. Get some rest tonight because we will be having a long night tomorrow.
Thanks, Drew.
Officials in Maricopa County, Arizona are hoping for the best heading into Election Day, but preparing for a repeat of 2020, when the county became the focus of wild election conspiracies and protesters attempting to disrupt vote counting. News Nation's Rich McHugh is on the ground in Maricopa County and reports election officials are focusing on security and transparency this time around.
Hey, we're here in Maricopa County, Arizona, the ultimate swing county in America, if you will. And the situation here looks a lot different than it did in 2020. I just want to show we're in front of one of these polling and tabulation centers. You can see concrete barriers on the outside. There's chain link fence that's been erected around the whole building. There's privacy tents. There's locked doors behind locked doors if you were to go inside. It's all in response to election night 2020 when protesters were outside demanding to get in the ballot counting centers, chanting, "Let us in." The sheriff here, Russ Skinner, says they have zero tolerance for that this time around.
So it is concerning to see that this heightened sense of security that questions the national, even global attention that Maricopa County has seen. But I want you to rest assured that there has been immense planning for many, many years relative to this operation for democracy, to make sure that this community is safe, to make sure that those locations are safe, to make sure that we get those ballots back to McTech safely.
Sheriff Skinner says he's been asked about drones or whether he's going to have snipers on top of these buildings. He wouldn't commit to either, but says he will be updating his security plan daily. Back to you.
Thank you, Rich McHugh. In addition to physical security threats, officials are working to make sure voters have confidence in the election results amid a flood of misinformation. News Nation's Trevor Shirley has the latest.
The FBI has now issued warnings on security and election interference, which officials say is coming from other countries. The FBI says several online videos depicting Haitian immigrants voting illegally in Georgia are fake. The intelligence community is blaming Russia, as that country has ramped up efforts to spread disinformation and sow doubts about election integrity among voters. The FBI's warning is part of an effort underway by U.S. officials to stress the security of U.S. elections, saying there are numerous ways the process is being protected, safeguards that start locally and go all the way to the federal level. In the meantime, physical security is also being enhanced. Several states have put the National Guard on standby in case of unrest, and some polling locations around the country are beefing up safety as well, as voters face historically long lines in some spots. And in Washington, security fencing is going up around sensitive sites over concerns of rioting or violence following the election results.
Whoever wins, half of the country is going to be very, very angry.
We will not tolerate any riots. We will not tolerate the destruction of property. We will not tolerate any unlawful behavior.
The FBI is also offering voters and citizens a way to report election-related crimes on its website. Reporting in Washington, I'm Trevor Shirley.
Thank you, Trevor. That new security fencing that's going up around D.C. is localized around the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and the residence of Vice President Kamala Harris. The preparations are being made as authorities prepare for possible political unrest in the days following the presidential election. The Secret Service constructed 8-foot-high metal fences around the White House, and additional security measures are in place outside the West Palm Beach, Florida Convention Center, where former President Trump will host an election night event. While officials say there are no current threats to Washington, D.C., local businesses and property owners near the White House have begun putting up fencing and plywood, worried upset supporters could cause violence and looting. Also on the ballot tomorrow, control of both chambers of Congress. News Nation's Mike Vaquera breaks down the numbers and what it could mean for the president-elect in the new year.
High stakes in Tuesday's election for control of the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Mike Vaquera with News Nation in Washington. There are 435 seats in the House, and all of them are up for election this year. Prospects for the new president's agenda could depend on who has a majority in the new Congress come January. As of right now, 220 seats are held by Republicans, to 12 by Democrats. There are 3 vacant seats. That adds up to a razor-thin GOP edge as it stands right now. Both parties are focused on key battleground districts across the nation. The Hill Decision Desk HQ Election Center rates 19 House races as toss-ups. They're located across the country, with many of the key races in New York and California. The Hill Decision Desk HQ says Republicans have a 53% chance of maintaining control of the House, while putting Democratic chances at 47%. I'm Mike Vaquera, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
He was a legendary musician and entertainment icon. We're talking about, of course, Quincy Jones, who died Sunday at his Bel Air estate at the age of 91. Jones's musical career spanned more than 70 years, working alongside A-list celebrities like Ray Charles, Michael Jackson, and Frank Sinatra. We're taking a look at his life and legacy.
Quincy Jones was America's music man in a career that spanned more than 70 years. He seamlessly switched from jazz, blues, pop, funk, and hip-hop. He won 28 Grammy Awards and received 80 Grammy nominations starting in 1961. Jones's musical journey started in the 1950s as a trumpet player in jazz bands. Soon after, he started working as an arranger and conductor. In the 1960s, he topped the pop charts, producing Leslie Gore's hit, It's My Party. Later in that decade, Jones produced several successful jazz collaborations with Frank Sinatra. He also started creating film scores, in total scoring more than 30 major motion pictures. In the 1970s, Jones recorded a series of his own chart-topping albums that fused jazz with R&B and funk. He also created theme songs for several hit TV shows, including Sanford and Son. But it was his collaboration with Michael Jackson that took Jones's career to new heights. Their first album, Off the Wall, made Jones the industry's most sought-after producer. The next album, Thriller, made history, becoming one of the best-selling albums ever. In 1985, Jones produced We Are the World, creating one of the best-selling singles of all time. His debut as a filmmaker came later that year with The Color Purple.
See me, get in the car, get in the car. Knock you up on
The film received 11 Oscar nominations. A few years later, Jones brought his magic touch to the small screen when he produced The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Later years saw more philanthropic work from Jones as he continued to mentor a new generation of artists. In 2013, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Quincy Delight Jones Jr.
And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.